Being Alive presents the acclaimed actor, singer, storyteller in his most electrifying role, concert performer. Being Alive is a collection of many of Mandy's favorite Broadway and classic American tunes. From Irving Berlin to Stephen Sondheim, from Cole Porter to Harry Chapin, Mandy Patinkin takes you on a dazzling musical journey you'll never forget. For tickets and more information, go to ordway.org or click the link in the show notes. Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talked to Julie Dean, the founder of Twin Cities Mussar. We talk about what Mussar is, where her passion for the practice comes from, and how the interest is growing in the Twin Cities, particularly since October 7th, on this week's Who the Folk podcast. But before we hear from Julie, the Who the Folk podcast is also sponsored by Ethan Roberts Photography. Spring is here, and if you need a photographer for any of your family events, then you need to check out Ethan Roberts and Ethan Roberts Photography. Ethan shot our child's senior photos last year, and they look fantastic, exactly what she and we were hoping for. But he also shoots professional headshots, weddings, parties, and other events. Check out his website at ethanrobertsphotos.com. Julie Dean, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Julie, you are one of the leading lights of Mussar and the Mussar community here in the Twin Cities. Do you hate that way I phrased that? You had just a brief look on your face like, what is he saying?
Well, I'm really passionate about Mussar.
Yes, you are. This is true.
And so it's a joy and it's a privilege for me to be able to share it with people and to help communities create Mussar programs and experiences and groups and help educate people about this incredible gem that's within our tradition that most people haven't heard of, or they're just starting to hear about it and they go, wait, is this new? Where did this come from? So it's just a joy. I love talking about Mussar.
Well, that's awesome. So you are the founder of Twin Cities Mussar?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I guess let's start at the very, very top. What is Mussar?
Okay, so Mussar is a Jewish spiritual pathway that comes through our tradition. Originally, it was a genre of literature that goes back as far as the 11th century and has roots in Torah. And it's around our character and how we show up in the world, how we act. So it's not enough to just do the mitzvot, but it's the quality of heart that we do them with. So take, for example, visiting the sick. If I go visit the sick, which is a mitzvah, if I do that begrudgingly, then am I really doing the mitzvah to the highest level of holiness? Okay, and so it's an opportunity. It creates opportunities for us to pause and consider, how am I going about life, and how am I doing different? How am I showing up in my relationships? How am I in my spiritual relationship? And I say it that way because people define it in so many different ways. That's very personal. And so Mussar, which started as a genre of literature, then became an actual practice in the 19th century in Eastern Europe. And it was primarily in yeshivas. And it was taking different character traits that we speak about as God's traits, but then saying, well, if our job in this life is to pursue holiness, and this is from like a religious perspective, right? Or you might say, look, if my job in this life is to do as well as I can, to show up and be a good person, to be a mensch, then what does that actually mean? And there's days when nobody feels like being a mensch. And on those days, I have choices in how I behave, right?
Right.
And so even just walking in here, how do I greet the person at the front desk? How do I sit here and talk with you? All of those things can be choices sometimes, especially when I'm not feeling quite up to showing up as my best self.
Right.
So Mussar is this pathway of working on these character traits that all of us have in different measure, like patience, gratitude, compassion, anger, all kinds of things like that.
And there are, like, we all have days where we don't want to show up as our best selves.
Sure.
For whatever reason.
Absolutely. And so we learn from those. Mm-hmm. You know, this doesn't mean that I'm supposed to show up and always be and my highest self. What it means is that I'm willing to look at how I show up.
Yeah.
Right? And that when I miss the mark, that I learn from it. And when I can make a correction, I do that. So that every day is an opportunity to learn. Yeah. But we're not trying to be perfect. We're just trying to take ownership over how we show up.
Yeah. So where does your passion for Mussar come from? Because obviously you are incredibly passionate about it. You've founded an organization that is devoted to that and spreading that word throughout the Twin Cities Jewish community. And beyond the Twin Cities, I would imagine. And this is sort of a universal Jewish concept, as you said. Where did it connect for you?
Well, I think that it's a great question. I think it comes back to each of us having choices in how we show up, and that we have the ability to make a difference in how we are. And so this idea that when I work on my own self, it impacts the world around me. Some people will say it's a pathway of tikkun halev, healing and repair of the heart, as a pathway toward tikkun olam, healing and repair of the world. And so I love that it's very practical. This is how I walk through the world. So it's taking Jewish wisdom and helping me think about how do I walk through the world. And then it can also be very spiritual, depending on what somebody's looking for. And how do I want to do life? What is life for? And some of those really big questions. This doesn't answer those questions, but what it does is it gives me a process and a path for living each day with some intention and learning from life. So where does that come from? I mean, my background is in facilitation. So I'm very interested in how people are as people. I'm a sociologist, and I have a master's in experiential education. So it's like get out of your head and into the real lived experience. And then I'm very committed and passionate about our Jewish community. And so I see and I hear how this really makes a difference in people's lives. So this isn't just theory and concept, but over and over again, I hear people talking about how engaging in this practice helps them live a better life. So then that keeps me going.
You were a camp person, weren't you?
I was.
I was going to say, because there's a lot of the experiential education, a lot of buzzwords in there. I'm like, okay, you were a camp person.
I
clearly.
was a camp person, and so I actually think of this like it's an adventure doing this, because it opens up doorways and pathways that I never would have explored otherwise.
How has Mussar and the way both you've chosen to practice it and to help teach it to others in the community, how has that brought you closer to this community?
Well, I get to interact with so many fantastic people, and I really love the Twin Cities Jewish community. This is a collaborative effort. So there are right now 5 synagogues that all have Mussar programs, and then there's also several organizations that have programs where people are doing this. So currently there are 18 different groups throughout the Twin Cities that are all practicing Mussar, and this Sunday we're all getting together for an annual Arsium, which is a celebration of our season of learning. Okay. So that not just, it's done as a group. So Mussar Vad, which means a meeting or a group, a Mussar group will meet for 12 times over 6 months. Okay. And people really get to know each other very well in this group. And there's a strong bond that forms there. But then when you expand that from that group to 18 groups getting together, and people come into the room and they go, I didn't know you were doing Mussar. I didn't know you were doing Mussar. And there's this shared language around ethics. So people who are in committees start to talk with some of this language around how do we want to show up and what are some of the ethics underlying this project we're doing. And it starts to ripple beyond just a personal effort to being more of a community effort and initiative. So in the Twin Cities, the clergy in town have embraced Mussar. They encourage participants in their congregation to get engaged. There's a lot of intercongregational connecting.
Oh, sure.
And then being able to have it expand to Harry K, where we're working with the Center for Leadership Excellence. And they're even bringing it into the day school where kids in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade were together working on learning about midot, these character traits. Yeah. We have a partnership with JFCS and J-Pride with the Queer Mussar VOD. And then there's new partnerships on the horizon, too. There's more. I've been approached by 4 additional groups that would like to get Mussar going this year.
That's so cool. So the fact that there happens to be 18 right now, that's not like a cap, because obviously 18 in Jewish numerology,
right? No,
is kind of a big number, right?
So, no, but there's no cap.
Okay,
there's no cap, and really, it's a tool.
Yeah.
Mussar gives us a language and a tool for living and how we show up, and so it would be wonderful to have multiple groups in every Jewish organization, because it's people paying attention to how they're showing up and people taking the time to cultivate relationships that are rooted in their values.
So the fact that there are 5 different synagogues, obviously this is across denominations.
Yes.
And so at the Siyum, which, as people are listening to this, if you're a subscriber to the pod, you will have heard about the Siyum shortly before it happens. Otherwise, it will have just taken place in the past tense. But for the people who are at, for example, Adath, and the people who are, for example, at Shir Tikva, mm-hmm. there's a common language that's being spoken between the two different groups, so that when they come together for the Siyum, there is, it's all on a level playing field.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And people attend a Mussar group honestly based on their schedule, and then also at their synagogue if they want to. But no matter what, when someone attends a Mussar VOD, they tend to return to their home synagogue more engaged. Mm-hmm. And so there are people that are going to another synagogue to join a group because it works for their schedule. And so people who I like to say we're getting out of the silos and into the sandbox. So instead of people just staying in their own synagogue community, they travel and go meet other people from other communities and then go back to their synagogue, and then they can connect with more people there as well. And I've heard a lot of clergy also bringing the language of Mussar and midot and these character traits into the sermons and all of that. And so it's a way of being, even more than a program.
That's really cool. The other thing that I found really interesting in how you've used this word a number of times, and with the phrase your Mussar practice.
Yeah,
that's very intentional use of language, I'm assuming, as opposed to
yes.
just going to you're practicing.
Right.
Like that's
right.
There's again a reason for that.
Yes. So Mussar is very consistent with the scientific research around mindfulness and around neuroplasticity. Mm-hmm. This idea that we can change our responses to life or change our reactions in life, right? Mm-hmm. So I have grown up a certain way, and when something happens, I react to it.
Right.
What happens if that same thing happens and I pause for a moment and think about, well, I could react the way I normally do, and when I do that, I know I'm going to get a certain response. But what else is available to me in that moment? Is there another response that actually might create a situation that serves me and the other person in our relationship to a higher degree? Does that make sense?
It does.
And so there is this power in that moment of choice when I can, if I'm able to, and sometimes I don't realize it till after it's happened, and I go, wow, look at that reaction that just took me back down that same path that I've gone down for years and years and years. But sometimes in the moment, I can actually pause and go, I'm going to try something different. Like, for example, if I'm working on patients, rather than having a knee-jerk response, I might just take a breath and hang in there quietly for just a moment, and then consider another kind of response that is has a little more kavod for the situation, a little more honor, respect for what's going on. And when I do that, just a small change creates a totally different trajectory for the result. Are you with me on that?
Yeah, I am with you.
Yeah. So the practice is really simple and doable because the Mussar teachers knew that if we set ourselves up for some very challenging practice and we don't do it, it's going to create a negative feedback loop.
Right.
So we create some practices that are really simple in order to create a positive feedback loop. So, for example, let's take the Midav Kavod, which I just mentioned.
Right.
So one of the practices of having more respect or honor for someone could be just greeting people with a smile. When you think about going through your daily life, how many people do you kind of ignore out in public, right? Like if you're going through, a store and, there's that kind of, you don't want to smile at people in the creepy way, but you do it in that inviting kind of like, hey, we're all human living on this planet together. Like, I see you, right? Just like a little acknowledgement, hello kind of thing.
So you mentioned the people who are teaching the classes. What makes someone qualified or trained to teach a Mussar class?
Okay, so let's get rid of the word teach and we'll replace it with facilitate.
Okay.
Because the facilitators are in it with the participants. We're all on this journey learning together. And so the people who facilitate have had more experience in Mussar. They've been part of a group. And then I have a facilitator training course. It's called Cultivating a Wise Heart. And it's about facilitation as an advanced Mussar practice. Because when I'm having this great conversation with you, if I'm in a room with 10 people, then we're all having a dialogue around this. Yeah. So it takes special skills to be able to be aware of my own reactions and responses, and then also to be reading what's going on in the group and being able to ask questions that are helping people dive into a classical text or into their own life and how it's applying. And so in the course, I have a new cohort starting in May, which I'm very excited, of people locally who are going to be facilitating. So for those folks who have been waiting for more Mussar groups, it is coming. I'm very happy to share that. So I provide mentoring for the facilitators. So it's an every other week practice when the groups meet, and I meet with the facilitators on the off week. And we talk about what's coming up, what's happening in your group, what's the next midah or trait that you're going to study, and what are your questions around that. And they have to find it in their own life first and be able to have some of that self-awareness before leading it with the group. But the facilitators in town are incredible. And I am so fortunate that I'm in this really positive, generative part of our Jewish community that's just exciting to be a part of. And it's growing organically. So I created Twin Cities Mussar as an umbrella for all of the different things that are happening in the community, the Mussar groups, and to be able to provide training and to be able to provide curriculum and materials and mentorship, and also community-wide workshops and things like that, so that people can start learning about this part of Judaism that's so rich and valuable. You don't have to be in a group to learn about Mussar.
Did the idea of Mussar and the people practicing it individually that you sort of learn about, did that spawn the creation of Twin Cities Mussar, or was it sort of vice versa?
So I was asked by Rabbi Adam Spilker to facilitate a Mussar group in coordination with a congregation-wide initiative in 2014.
Oh, and Mount Zion.
at Mount Zion.
Okay.
So at High Holy Days, he spoke about Mussar to the congregation and invited people to sign up for a group. And close to 80 people signed up.
Wow.
So we had these very large Mussar groups. And from there, I continued my group and I kept learning more about it. And I went through some training through the Mussar Institute. And then Sarah Lynn Newberger and I started working together. She led a group through Hineni, and then it moved over to Shir Tikva, and then she worked with Adath, and then I started working with Temple Israel, and Cantor Audrey Abrams was working with Bethel, and it just started spreading. And then I was invited to do a clergy training. So I did a clergy training for a group of people, which helped it keep going and spreading, and it's just continued and continued. So then I led a cohort of 12 people to be trained, and then they all went out and started leading groups. And there's a 20s and 30s group as well. And so it just keeps growing organically. And then a few people said, hey, let's do a podcast. I'd really like to do a podcast. And that's how Living Mussar was born, which is the name of our podcast. And yeah, it's just a huge blessing. Every time I ask my husband, I wonder what's coming next. I don't know what's coming next. The next day, it feels like something shows up and people say, let's do this and let's do this.
Well, we'll get to the podcast in a sec. You segued like a bit early, but that's okay. That's fine. We'll get to it for sure. But I did want to, ask though, it does seem like the organic growth of it is what is making it successful, as opposed to it being a you-driven thing. It's a community-driven thing. And you just happen to help move the pieces around the board a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I have been very motivated and inspired to do this. So when someone's showing an interest, I really strive to help make that happen.
Yeah.
And so I would say it's a community effort. And there are people that are definitely, they give me a lot of kavod for my involvement with this, because I think it is an emergent body of work. In Judaism, one piece I wanted to mention is that the schools and students of Mussar in the 19th century perished in the Holocaust to a great extent.
Yeah.
And so this whole body of work was really rediscovered somewhat recently. And now it's coming back into the community, but coming through a much broader group than the Orthodox yeshivas of the 19th century. So now it's coming out to be more accessible to people. So in order to facilitate that, it's very important to keep developing curriculum that include modern voices, as well as classical texts, and to also open up groups to all people in our community who are interested. So that means, all of the groups in town are open to all people, and some people appreciate having a group that is exclusively for members of the queer community or for people in the Multiracial Jewish Alliance. So that's another group that we're creating a Mussar group with for this fall, or even people in their 20s and 30s. And so I am very passionate to help create those opportunities and those ongoing opportunities, and have written curriculum that are for multi-year experiences. So people take a group and then they stay in it ongoing.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And I love helpers. Let me just say, I love helpers and appreciate all the engagement from people that are willing to give of their time and effort to help continue the growth and expansion of this.
I mean, you couldn't do it without that.
Right.
It seems like it's grown and continuing to grow well past the ability for one person to be able to do this all on their own.
Yes. So I'm seeking those people who are interested in getting more involved.
You mentioned that there are several new groups that you're hoping to get off the ground At least that is the plan for 2024. What is leading to this, I guess, increased level of interest in Musar as a practice? And where is that coming from in your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. This year, most of our groups started right after October 7th. And I have heard from many people who are currently in Musar groups how invaluable both their skill building and the community support has meant to them, especially this year. You know, our VODs are not a support group or a therapy group or a place for political analysis, but what we do study is classical Jewish wisdom and how to navigate the inevitable ups and downs of life. And so this year in particular, as our Jewish community is more divided than I've ever experienced it in my own life, people are seeking ways to both stay connected to Jewish community as well as to members of their family and friends that may have different views than they do. And coming together in a Musar group is a place to do that skill building and to connect with our roots and our tradition. We've certainly been through very hard times as a people. And we need these skills more than ever now because our resilience is really being challenged. So I have been offering sessions called Musar for Resilience, and the first session was on self-compassion. That first we have to be with ourselves and recognize everything that we're going through in order to be regulated in these conversations. And then I'll be holding additional citywide workshops throughout this year under that umbrella of Musar for Resilience. And if anyone's interested, they can sign up for our newsletter at twincitiesmussar.org. And they are welcome to come to any of these workshops to learn about how to cultivate more chesed, loving kindness, or compassion, rachamim, or especially shmirat halashon, mindful speech. So I think that there's an increasing demand, both because people have been listening to the podcast and they've been hearing how Musar makes an impact in people's lives, and also because we're really reaching a place where we need to find new ways to connect with each other, especially across divides with family, with community, and even in the broader picture.
Have you heard from any of the people who you're facilitating for, or I guess you heard from your group of facilitators in their own groups, of any examples of how um, things that they've learned in their practice have translated in some of those, like, how to navigating conversations that might be difficult with friends or family?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that I'm thinking of one pairing in particular of a mother and a daughter, and she's an adult child. And the two of them were at an impasse because they have very different political views. And it was starting to create a huge distance in what was previously a close relationship. So they wanted each other to take on their perspective and their views. So independently, they were each in a VOD, and one was working on chesed while the other one was working on chesed, on loving kindness. And in that practice, we talk about doing things for another person based on what they need, not on what we think is best for them. And part of that is really looking at them through the lens of compassion as well, that they're not an imperfect version of who we are, they're who they are.
Right.
And so they were able to discuss this desire to come together and have dialogue with each other. And then they also had this shared language of Musar where they could bring in, for example, humility, saying, okay, I want to just listen to you fully and not react. I want to give you space to be you. And so this mother and daughter, over time, by integrating these concepts of Musar and really desiring to stay close, they were inspired to be able to start building their skills to be able to listen to each other with compassion and allow each other to have different views as an act of loving kindness. There was another person who had been a previous participant but had taken a little break in his Mussar practice, and he called me up and said, I really need to join a VOD, a Mussar group, because I'm looking at the year ahead. And with the war and with the upcoming election, I need to strengthen myself for the challenges in our national and international sphere, as well as the compounding personal different things that he had going on. You know, life can be challenging no matter what. And so coming together and both applying Jewish wisdom, being able to be in Jewish community, and also integrating the skill building and language for the inner life to help us navigate this. This is something our people have been doing for centuries.
I think it's really interesting how sort of the ancient wisdom that is sort of the bedrock of what Mussar is so easily applied, maybe not always easily, but certainly applied and applicable to modern day events and relationships.
Absolutely, because in addition to the classical text, there's the text of your own life, and each person is the expert in their own life. And at least in applying the different principles and practices to their own life. So if you and I were in a group, I would be so curious about, how does this show up for you? In what way do you want to work with this? And for me, it might be different, but we still have the same virtues or character traits, these inside of us, the midot, and we have them all within different measure. And that's what midah means, is measure. So we have all these different traits within different measure, and we can learn how to work with those traits in order to better serve ourselves and our relationships and in our world.
That's great. That's amazing. All right, so now I want to go back to the podcast.
Okay.
Living Mussar, 5 episodes in.
We have a whole season in the can.
That's amazing.
So our first season is done.
That's
yes,
great.
And we're meeting next week for a retreat to plan our second season.
Outstanding. Now, I was, in the interest of full disclosure, I was happy to hop on a Zoom with you, with Jenny Schwartz, who's the host of the show, with Michael. I'm going to leave people out, and I apologize.
It's Jenny Schwartz and Michael Cooney and Bonnie Dykle Hoffman.
Okay, thank you.
And it's this amazing team of volunteers.
Which is incredible. That, again, a totally volunteer-driven operation has put together a very nice product.
Thank you.
It's interesting because it talks about, Mussar and like some of the traits that you talk about, but also how I like telling people stories. That's why I love doing this podcast. That's why I love being a journalist, is getting to talk to people and hear their stories and hear the interesting things that they do. And this is just another avenue to sort of learn about these really interesting people and their connection to this practice and how it connects to their Judaism and sort of the mesh point of all of that.
Yeah, you get to hear real life stories of how this Mussar practice and their learning impacts their life.
Yeah.
And it's such a privilege to get to hear those stories. And so we get to hear them in a Mussar group, and we thought, why not share them out loud and let people know? And we can really learn from each other. One of the principles within, also under Kavod, is that all of us are teachers and learners. And so we can learn from each other's stories and grow in that way.
Well, it is a great show, and I'm excited to hear what season 2 looks like
after
the retreat. I think it's going to be really it's interesting, and it's a great use of storytelling. It all connects really well, and it's because it's volunteer driven. It's people took it and ran with it, and then this
Yes.
investment in making it go.
Yes. And nobody knew anything about how to do a podcast. So everybody dove in and started learning how to record, what kind of gear we need, how to do social media for it, and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and so it's very grassroots, and it's beautiful. It's recorded in my son's bedroom, and it's a lot of fun.
The early pandemic Who the Folk podcasts were recorded in my bedroom closet, as I had a wife and 2 children who were all work or school from home. I needed a quiet place to record. So shut out the kids, shut out the dog, sit on the floor with, surrounded by clothing, and this is how we do it.
Yes.
Sometimes you don't need to see how the sausage gets made.
Right.
But our first Jew Folk fundraiser that we did during the pandemic in 2020, we did an interview with Governor Walz. There was the group of us that were podcasting for Jew Folk at the time, and I am sitting on the floor of my bedroom in a conversation with the governor of Minnesota.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's, you do what you need to do.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And all the glossiness doesn't matter.
No, not at all. So it's just about putting out a good product.
Yeah. And that's quite the metaphor for what we're talking about with Mussar.
Yeah.
All the external, all the glossiness doesn't matter. It's when we look at ourselves in our own life as the product, it's putting out a good product, taking some active agency in how we show up.
That was well done.
Thank you.
That was really good. You're clearly a professional in this area. That was... I can't. I got nowhere to go after that. Last couple questions then, and we're going to wrap it up. First, what is your favorite Jewish food?
Challah. Fresh baked challah.
Do you bake?
I do.
Okay.
I do. I make it every Shabbos with some honey, a little bit of cinnamon in it. I love it. Mm-hmm.
Oh, cinnamon in it.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And the smell fills the whole house.
Oh, yeah.
I love that.
No, that's really... Mm-hmm. Yeah, we bake challah in our house. We tend to do it like every 3 weeks, so I'll make 3 loaves at once and then freeze 2. And
yeah.
It gets hard to...
What's your favorite?
Favorite challah?
Your favorite Jewish food?
Oh. I'm going to use the loophole that many of my guests do when I ask and just name a bunch of them. Mm-hmm. Love latkes.
Yes.
Love latkes. Blintzes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Bagels.
Mm-hmm.
Those are probably like the big 3.
Yeah.
I could come up with a 4th and we could go like a Mount Rushmore of Jewish foods, but since Passover is coming up, I will say my charoset.
Okay. Yeah.
I love charoset.
Yeah.
All right. What's your favorite, last question, what is your favorite Jewish holiday? Speaking of holidays.
It truly would be Shabbos.
Okay.
Is my favorite. I look forward to it each week, and I have good times with people, and I am really grateful to be able to have that day for rejuvenation and for connecting and for unplugging and all of that.
Well, that's awesome. And with, fresh baked challah
Yes.
every Friday night, it would be my favorite too. So
yes.
Julie Dean, Twin Cities Mussar, and the Living Mussar podcast. Congratulations on first season being in the can.
Thank you.
We look forward to season 2, and we will have links to everything in the show notes. But thank you for joining me this week. This was great.
Thank you, Lonnie. It was a pleasure.
The Who the Folk podcast is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network and a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.